Hi, welcome back to our lecture. The next service I want to cover is the AWS Codedeploy service. And this is a managed service which will automate the deployment of our application code into different environments. And these environments could be EC2 instances or Lambda functions. They could be Docker containers running in ECS. You could even deploy code into on-premise servers. The benefit of a code deploy service is that it allows you to rapidly release new features into your different environments. And you can leverage some of the capabilities of code deploy to avoid or minimize any sort of downtime during the application deployment process. I mean, basically, code deploy is an automated way of deploying your application code. You know, way back in the day when we were deploying our application code to different environments, we would generally log into a server manually and then download our new application code. We'd run a series of commands to update the application and the services that are running on the server. And, so if we had 10 servers, then one by one, we'd have to kind of log in manually to each one and update each server individually. And of course, anytime you do something manually, you run the risk of making mistakes. Now, manually updating a handful of servers might not be that problematic, but what happens if you have dozens or even hundreds, maybe even thousands of servers? If you were to try to manually update those, it would just be nearly impossible, and of course you'd make lots of mistakes in the process. A service like Codedeploy can update hundreds or thousands of servers, and it will follow the exact same deployment process every single time. So how does Codedeploy work? Well, the overall process is that you begin by telling Codedeploy about your application, and you tell Codedeploy how it should deploy your application and where it should deploy it to. And you do that by creating a special configuration file called the AppSpec.yaml file and adding it to your application bundle. And when I say application bundle, I'm talking about the sort of output artifact that you create when you go through your build process. As part of that, you'll add an AppSpec.yaml file. The Codedeploy service will then use that AppSpec YAML file to determine how to actually deploy the application to your environment. Codedeploy also has this notion of a deployment, and a deployment is the actual process of deploying your application bundle to a set of computing resources. So when you think about it, you have your application deployment configuration, and your application configuration is the sort of template that is used to describe what software needs to be installed, where it should install it on each individual computing resource. And that's what's defined by the AppSpec.yaml file. And then every single time you want to deploy that your application, you create a separate deployment, and the deployment then initiates the actual installation of your software application on your computing resources. So let's sort of define the key components that are part of this Codedeploy service. First, you have the actual application, and the actual application are those code components that you want to deploy to compute resources. you have your compute platform. And your compute platform describes where you want to deploy your application code to. And it could be EC2 instances or Lambda functions or ECS containers. You have a deployment group. And the deployment group is sort of a set of compute instances that you want to deploy your application to. You can imagine, like, let's say you had 10 different EC2 servers, EC2 instances, and you wanted to deploy your application to 5 of them. Well, those 5 instances then would make up a deployment group. And then finally, you have your deployment type. And the deployment type defines the method that's going to be used to actually deploy the application into the environments. And there are a couple different application deployment types you can pick from. There are in-place deployments and there are blue-green deployments. In-place deployments mean that we are updating our existing compute instances. And we can update those instances in a couple different ways. We can update our compute instances one at a time. And this is similar to a rolling release. We can update half of our instances at one time and then half of the instances at another time. That's kind of like a rolling release with a minimum number of compute instances in service. Or we could update all of our instances at once, which is basically the same as a big bang release, which is something that we generally don't really want to do in any sort of production environment because that's going to mean downtime for our customers. And that second deployment type is a blue-green deployment. And if you recall, with the blue-green deployment, instead of replacing the software in our existing compute instances, we're just going to spin up an entirely new set of instances and deploy our new software code to those new instances, and then leverage a load balancing capability to switch our customers over to the new service. I mentioned that you create an AppSpec file as part of your application bundle. And this is essentially a YAML file which describes how the code deploy service is going to install the application on your chosen compute platform, like EC2. And the AppSpec file does a couple different things. And it's actually a fairly simple file to understand. So it describes where those installation files or those application files are going to be installed on those compute instances. So like, exactly what directory those application files are going to be installed into. It can define the file permissions for those files that are being installed on the compute instances. And then the AppSpec file can also specify a set of scripts to run. And these are like installation scripts. When we install our software, we might need to do a couple things, like maybe we need to shut down the web server that's running on the compute instance. Maybe we need to update a database after we have deployed our software. There could be a whole set of different things that we need to do on the compute instance as part of the application software deployment. And we can specify all of those steps in the appspec.yaml file. Here's an example of what that YAML file might look like. It starts with a version. It's got an OS, files, permissions, and hooks section. And we'll look at each one of these real quickly. The version section defines the version of the file. And at the time of this video recording, for the version, you can just use 0.0. For the OS, we're installing on a Linux OS. And then we define the files. And this is just, a simple case of defining the source and the destination. So the source is in this example is myapp.jar. That's the source file that we're pulling from the application bundle. And we're going to store it in a destination on the server. We want to store it in /var/app/myapp.jar. And we want the /var/app directory to have these particular file permissions. It's going to have a certain group, a mode, and that's defining the access permissions for that directory. And then the last section, which is maybe the most important in some ways, is the hooks section. And there are, you can think of a hook as being sort of like a trigger. And what this hook is saying is that after the software is installed, so essentially after these files have been copied and put in a certain destination and the permissions applied, then we want to run a script, and the script is located in the scripts directory under a shell script file called run_tests.sh. And that scripts directory that subdirectory is just part of our application bundle. So it lives with the output artifact that we're creating alongside the AppSpec.yaml file and whatever code that we actually want to deploy onto our compute instance. There are a number of different hooks that are available to us. These are different sort of lifecycle events which occur during the actual deployment process in the compute instance. And the different events that are available will depend on the different sorts of compute environments and the deployment types that we choose from. So this is just sort of an example that we can follow for a basic deployment process. But think of these as events that occur during the deployment process, and we can trigger the execution of different scripts based upon each sort of event.